You probably heard someone or other make the statement that we've never been more divided as a country. It's one of these phrases that gets repeated a lot. Personally, I can recall hearing it my whole life. Of course, it can't be true every time someone says it. There has to be a particular time when we were actually the most divided. My vote would be for the Civil War. But the fact that this never more divided thing comes up so much indicates that partisanship is both a perennial feature of American life and something we're not really that comfortable with. But how did partisanship get started? The election of 1800. The battle is between these two parties, the Federalists, who run John Adams, and the Democrat Republicans, who run Thomas Jefferson. These two parties in some ways map onto the divide over the Constitution. John Adams represents what might in early America have been called the right, and Jefferson what could be called the left. The reason I'm hesitant about these is because these categories have shuffled in some really major ways since 1800. They mean different things to people now. But Adams's Federalists were supported by the kinds of people who had wanted the Constitution. People who generally they were concerned about protection of property. They weren't necessarily a fan of the kind of masses of poorer people, the Democratic mob. They were worried about the dangers of too much democracy. One major state policy they supported was the economic policy developed by Alexander Hamilton, who served in the administrations of Washington and Adams. Hamilton's policy is the kind of ambitious project that could happen with a strong centralized government. Its elements were this national bank that could take on the debts of the various states, manage their repayment, as well as lend money to start new industrial businesses that Hamilton thought would be good for the country. Other parts of Hamilton's plan were federal sales taxes, such as a tax on whiskey, and tariffs, which you might have heard about recently. And the Democrat Republicans are basically the opposite. They kind of emerged from the anti-federalist movement. They were established to critique Washington's administration, and after that, the administration of Adams, and really not fans of Alexander Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasury, remained a powerful player under these governments. The Democrat Republicans wanted a smaller government. They wanted to scrap any program they felt went beyond the narrowest definition of the authority granted to the government by the Constitution. For them, all of Hamilton's financial plan was undesirable. They especially didn't like the bank. Nowhere in the Constitution was a national bank mentioned. It seemed to go that the government was expanding its powers beyond what was allowed in the Constitution. They thought that it opened the door to corruption. Along with these different ideas went different visions for what the nation should be like. And there were different groups of people who supported them, as I said. The Federalist vision for the country was one that would aspire sort of to the glory of England. Like England, America would become home to powerhouse industries, possess a big military, be a big, powerful, wealthy country on the world stage. People who favored this policy were, of course, those who benefited the most from Hamilton's economic system, especially wealthy business people tending to be concentrated in the coast, especially in the north. The Democrat-Republican vision for America is still known today as Jeffersonianism, after the party leader and presidential candidate Thomas Jefferson. It meant a nation of farmers where everyone had enough land to support themselves and a family. There weren't great differences of wealth. This is the kind of system they believed would emerge organically in the absence of too powerful of a central government favoring business interests. So obviously the people who supported this party tended to be farmers themselves, including those who had sympathized with movements like Shays' Rebellion and opposed the adoption of the Constitution. But in addition to small-scale family farmers, some of the people who most strongly supported the party were owners of large slave plantations, like Jefferson himself was. These people valued their independence from government, particularly from a government that they thought was dominated by people who favored northern business interests, businesses that didn't rely on slaves. The tariff was one of the major ways in which the Federalist policy was seen to favor the interests of these businesses over those of the slave-owning planters. A tariff was good for manufacturers. A tariff if we just remember what that is a tax on imports. And it was good for manufacturers because it kept competition out and enabled those industries to develop. But the planters were consumers rather than producers of manufactured goods. They wanted prices on these goods to be as low as possible. So they didn't want to keep out potentially cheaper goods from abroad. They also feared starting trade wars in Europe. If Europe started tariffs to get revenge for our tariffs, then they wouldn't be able to sell their agricultural products abroad. This is still an issue today, not with slave owners, obviously, but with farmers. So there was a lot of emotion attached to this, and each side kind of viewed the other side as really dangerous. There was a lot of mudslinging during the campaign. A quote from Jefferson's camp is that Adams had, quote, a hideous hermaphroditical character, which has neither the force and firmness of a man, nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. Whatever the hell that means, but it sounds mean, right? And we can almost imagine an insult like that perhaps appearing today in our politics. But just so we know, things weren't always that civil back in the good old days either. So it's worth... hold on a second, adjusting my notes. Very sorry. Okay, so Jefferson would win in 1800 after this drawn-out dispute over the results of the election. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but controversies over the result of elections is also not this brand new thing in American history. But the settlement of this controversy without bloodshed, the peaceful transfer of power from Adams to his rival Jefferson, is considered a major sort of achievement in human history. It's really the first successful democratic election in the modern world to be carried out that way. But what kind of country would Jefferson create? Well, he wouldn't stop the gradual development of America into a more industrial country. He wouldn't smash the American state, but he did make some changes. He allowed the national bank charter to expire, although it would be renewed pretty soon. He got rid of the hated whiskey tax. He also did something which was really totally against the supposed limited government values of his party, but was still very popular, especially among farmers. He bought the territory of Louisiana from France. France, we sort of maybe has dropped out of the picture a little bit, but they still owned like the whole middle of the country, the whole middle of the modern U.S., which was called Louisiana. We're not just talking about the state of Louisiana. We're talking about big area. He bought that for about 3 cents an acre. He considered that a very good deal. It probably was, but he didn't consult Congress about it, so kind of arbitrary executive action. But he also... Jefferson's administration shifted the culture of the country in important ways. The kind of elitism of the Federalists, this idea that the people, the masses, can't really be trusted, that would fall out of favor, whereas the populism of Jefferson would become more the norm. From Jefferson's time on, candidates for president would have to at least pretend to be on the side of the people. I'll see you in the next video.